Early March 1943, Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea. The wrench slipped from his oil-streaked hands as Captain Paul Irvin Gunn stared at the modified bomber in front of him. Inside that aircraft was something that should never have existed, something that defied every rule in the United States Army Air Force's manual, and something his superior officers had never officially approved. 8 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns jutted from the nose where a bombardier's glass enclosure once belonged. The B-25 Mitchell, a medium bomber originally designed for high-altitude precision strikes, had been turned into something completely different: an ocean predator, a commerce destroyer, an unauthorized experiment that could either save the Pacific Campaign or get Gunn court-martialed. What neither Gunn nor anyone else yet understood was that this illegal modification, born of desperation and personal rage, would soon unleash the greatest naval disaster the Japanese Empire would face in the entire Pacific War. The arithmetic of Allied victory in the Southwest Pacific was not being calculated in Washington's planning rooms, but in welding bays and makeshift hangars by a 43-year-old maverick fighting a private war of his own. His moment had begun more than a year earlier, on December 8, 1941, Manila time. Paul Irvin Gunn, not yet called Pappy by anyone, stood at Nichols Field watching Japanese bombers systematically annihilate the American air unit stationed in the Philippines. As operations manager for the newly established Philippine Airlines, he had 4 Red Beach 18 civilian planes under his control. Within mere hours, Major General Louis Brereton would seize those aircraft for military use and commission Gunn as a captain in the Army Air Corps. What was supposed to be a short wartime assignment would instead become a 3-year odyssey driven by invention, vengeance, and sheer determination. At 42, Gunn was a retired Navy Chief Petty Officer who had spent 2 decades as an enlisted naval aviator before leaving the service in December 1939. He had learned to fly during the 1920s, served with the famed Top Hatters Squadron, and taught future pilots at the Pensacola Naval Air Station. His knowledge of aircraft came not from manuals, but from 20 years of flying, repairing, and occasionally crashing them. But on that fateful December morning, none of that experience mattered. Gunn faced a far more personal crisis. His wife, Clara Louise, known to all as Polly, and their 4 children were trapped in Manila as Japanese forces closed in on the city. His 2 sons, Paul Jr. and Nathan, were teenagers, while his daughters, Connie and Julie, were still young. The family had been living comfortably in Manila, while Gunn managed the airline, but that life had vanished overnight. In the chaotic weeks that followed, Gunn flew reconnaissance and supply missions through the collapsing Philippine defenses. He dodged Japanese fighters, survived being shot down in the jungle, trekked to safety, and immediately returned to the skies. On one daring flight, he earned the Distinguished Flying Cross by piloting an unarmed transport plane into Bataan to deliver vital medical supplies to trapped American troops, navigating enemy-controlled skies armed only with courage and skill. Yet, despite his efforts, he could not reach his family. On Christmas Eve, 1941, Gunn received orders to evacuate key personnel to Australia. He withdrew all his pay, borrowed what he could from fellow officers, and prepared to take his loved ones to safety. But the Japanese advance moved too swiftly. His family never made it to the airfield. Gunn was forced to make an impossible decision: to obey orders or risk everything for his family. He flew to Australia because that was what the Army demanded, because the war was larger than one man's grief, because staying meant certain death or capture. Within weeks, on January 20th, 1942, Polly and the children were seized by Japanese forces and imprisoned in the University of Santo Tomas, which had been turned into an internment camp for enemy civilians. When Gunn learned of this, something inside him broke forever. The man who kept fighting afterward was no longer the same one who had left Manila. He had abandoned his wife and children to an enemy known for cruelty, and every day they spent in captivity was a day he could not protect them. The only way left to fight was to end the war as fast as possible. If he couldn't rescue his family, he would destroy every ship, every aircraft, and every supply line that kept Japan's armies alive in the Philippines. This was not official policy. It was personal vengeance masquerading as military innovation. When Major General George C. Kenney arrived in Brisbane in late July 1942 to assume command of the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, he found near collapse. His predecessor had been dismissed, morale was abysmal, and the Japanese dominated the skies over New Guinea, threatening Australia itself. General Douglas MacArthur, the theater commander, had no faith in his air arm and made that fact painfully clear. Kenney, then 53 years old, was a World War I fighter ace with 2 confirmed kills and a Silver Star to his name. He had taught at the Air Corps Tactical School and was known for his creative, unorthodox thinking. When MacArthur subjected him to an hour-long lecture about the failings of Allied air power, Kenney listened politely and then requested one concession: authority to send home any officer he judged to be deadwood. MacArthur, taken aback by the bold demand, granted it. Within weeks, Kenney had reorganized his command, bringing in more aggressive younger leaders and establishing a forward headquarters in New Guinea to accelerate decision-making. He named Brigadier General Ennis Whitehead as his forward commander and empowered him to reassign aircraft according to weather and tactical necessity instead of waiting for orders from Brisbane. But swapping personnel meant little without effective weaponry to employ. Allied bombing from medium and high altitude was proving disastrously ineffective against Japanese shipping. High-altitude runs gave targets ample time to maneuver. The B-17 flying fortresses were scoring on fewer than 1% of their aims. Japanese convoys continued to resupply their New Guinea garrisons with near impunity. Allied ground troops were dying in the jungle, while fresh Japanese formations poured ashore from ships that bombers could not sink. Kenney had been pondering this shortcoming since 1928, when he had been an instructor at the tactical school. He had theorized about skip bombing, then releasing bombs at very low altitude, so they would skip across the water like stones and strike ships at the hull below the waterline where armor was weakest. The idea made sense in theory, but was hard to pull off in practice. B-17s lacked forward-firing armament. Coming in at mast height meant flying through intense anti-aircraft fire with nothing to suppress the gunners. Then Kenney discovered Paul Gunn and everything shifted. In August 1942, Kenney learned someone in the 3rd Attack Group was modifying a number of Havoc light bombers without authorization. The alterations were rough but effective. The transparent bombardier's nose had been removed and replaced with 4 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. The intention was to strafe Japanese positions at very low altitude to suppress ground fire before dropping bombs. Kenney investigated and found Captain Paul Gunn essentially working alone, salvaging weapons from wrecked fighters and installing them in attack aircraft. Gunn had taught himself aircraft modification by trial and error. He lacked a formal engineering degree but understood airframe structures, weight distribution, and weapon systems from 2 decades of hands-on experience. Most commanders would have court-martialed him for unauthorized modifications. Kenney instead placed him on his personal staff as Special Projects Officer and gave him an almost impossible task: convert every A-20 in the theater for low-altitude attack and do it immediately. Gunn worked 18-hour days. He scavenged guns from crashed planes, fabricated mounting brackets in makeshift workshops, and personally test flew each conversion. He fitted 4 50-caliber machine guns into the nose of every A-20, mounted additional guns along the fuselage, and installed racks for parachute fragmentation bombs. The modified A-20s entered combat in September 1942, striking a Japanese airfield at Buna. The outcome surpassed expectations. The strafer A-20s came in at treetop level with guns blazing, suppressing anti-aircraft positions before releasing their bombs. Japanese defenders used to high-altitude bombers that announced their arrival minutes in advance had no time to respond. The raid destroyed dozens of aircraft on the ground and proved that low-level strafing could change air warfare. Kenney immediately ordered Gunn to adapt a similar modification for B-25 Mitchell medium bombers. The B-25 was larger than the A-20, with greater range, a heavier bomb load, and the capacity to carry more forward-firing weapons. If Gunn could convert the Mitchell into a gunship, it would become the theater's most effective anti-shipping weapon. The B-25 Mitchell had been designed in 1939 as a medium-altitude level bomber. It was a twin-engine airplane with a wingspan of 67 feet 7 inches, powered by 2 Wright R2600 radial engines, each producing 1,700 horsepower. Standard armament consisted of 6 50-caliber machine guns for defense and a 3,000-pound bomb capacity. It carried a crew of 5: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, radio operator, and gunner. The aircraft was named for General Billy Mitchell, the controversial air power advocate court-martialed in 1925 for his outspoken views. About 9,890 B-25s would eventually be built at 2 North American plants, one in Inglewood, California, and another in Kansas City, Kansas. The B-25 achieved fame in April 1942 when Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 B-25Bs on a daring raid against Tokyo, launching from the carrier USS Hornet. The raid inflicted little physical damage, but delivered a massive morale boost to Americans still reeling from Pearl Harbor. Crucially, it forced Japan to keep fighters at home to defend the mainland, rather than deploying them to forward fronts. Yet the B-25's main role remained medium-altitude bombing, a task at which it was failing against ships. Gunn looked at the Mitchell and saw potential that few others recognized. The aircraft's nose was spacious enough to accept several heavy machine guns mounted together. The twin-engine layout offered redundancy so that losing one engine would not necessarily doom the airplane. Its robust airframe could take considerable punishment without falling apart. Most critically, the Mitchell had sufficient range to reach Japanese shipping lanes that the shorter-ranged A-20 simply could not reach. In late 1942, Gunn began converting B-25s inside a maintenance hangar at Townsville, Australia. He worked alongside Captain Jack Fox, the North American aviation technical representative in the theater. Fox's official job was to ensure that any modifications adhered to factory standards. Instead, he became Gunn's partner in what would evolve into the war's most effective unauthorized aircraft conversion program. The first task was removing the bombardier and the glass nose assembly. This both saved weight and eliminated a vulnerable compartment that served no purpose in low-altitude attack. Gunn replaced the transparent nose with a solid metal block that housed 4 forward-firing 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns, all under the pilot's control. Each gun carried 500 rounds of ammunition. With a cyclic rate near 850 rounds per minute per gun, the pilot could unleash a torrent of lead capable of shredding most targets in seconds. But 4 guns did not satisfy Gunn. He added 2 additional 50-caliber weapons in cheek blisters on either side of the forward fuselage, just below and slightly behind the cockpit. These blister guns protruded marginally beyond the propeller arc, so they could fire without bullets intersecting the propeller disc. They were fixed forward-firing weapons that increased the pilot's forward punch. Then Gunn made a bold decision regarding the dorsal turret. The B-25 normally carried a rotating dorsal turret with twin 50-caliber guns behind the cockpit to defend from attacks above and astern. Gunn fixed that turret in the forward position, effectively adding 2 more guns under the pilot's control. The co-pilot could operate these guns through a sight in the cockpit, or the pilot could fire every weapon together via a master trigger. The result was a modified B-25 with 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns delivering roughly 180 pounds of projectiles every second. For perspective, a single P-51 Mustang carried 6 50-caliber guns. The altered B-25 concentrated the forward firepower of more than one fighter into a platform that still carried 2,000 pounds of bombs. The changes introduced serious engineering problems. Shifting all that mass into the nose pushed the center of gravity forward, making the airplane nose-heavy and harder to handle. Gunn offset this by moving equipment aft and adding ballast to the tail section. The simultaneous recoil of 8 guns also produced substantial structural stress. Gunn reinforced the nose with extra bracing to withstand those loads. The weapons produced intense heat and smoke, so he installed improved ventilation and relocated ammunition stores to reduce the risk of fire. Perhaps the trickiest issue was gun harmonization. All 8 weapons had to be aligned to converge at a single point ahead of the aircraft, typically between 200 and 400 yards. If they were misaligned, the rounds would scatter and miss the intended target. Gunn devised a ground testing method using measured range targets, adjusting each mount until every gun converged precisely. He personally test-fired the installations, making minute tweaks, and refused to accept any aircraft that did not meet his standards. Working non-stop, the full modification required about 2 weeks per aircraft. He trained maintenance crews to replicate the work and established production line procedures. By December 1942, he had converted enough B-25s to outfit the 91st Bombardment Squadron, which needed a commander who understood low-level attack and would not be constrained by orthodox bombing doctrine. Kenny selected Major Ed Larner, a pilot who had been rapidly promoted from first lieutenant to major because of aggressive combat leadership. Larner had proven deft at low-level missions and had earned Kenny's confidence. Larner and Gunn together developed the tactics that would reshape naval combat. The converted B-25s would close on Japanese ships at extremely low altitude, sometimes down to 50 feet above the water, while running at top speed, roughly 300 miles per hour. At that height and velocity, they were almost impossible for shipboard gunners to track. The closing speed outran manual aiming, and the planes were gone before gunners could bring their sights to bear. As the Mitchells neared target ships, pilots opened up with all 8 forward guns at around 1,000 yards, walking their fire into the vessel. The resulting stream of 50 caliber rounds swept the deck, suppressing or killing anti-aircraft crews, destroying gun emplacements, shredding superstructures, and sowing confusion. The goal was not primarily to sink the ship by gunfire, although the damage could be severe. The objective was to silence the ship's defenses and terrify the crew. Then came the bombs. At roughly 200 to 400 yards and flying at minimum safe altitude, the pilot released a bomb fitted with a 4 to 5 second delayed fuse. The bomb would leave the aircraft moving at roughly 300 miles per hour, strike the surface of the water, and skip forward like a stone. It might bounce once, maybe twice, before smashing into the ship's side at or just below the waterline. The delayed fuse ensured that the bomb wouldn't explode upon impact. Instead, it would pierce the hull, sink just beneath the surface, and then detonate moments later. The explosion occurred in the weakest part of the vessel, below the armored belt where the hull plating was thinnest. The power of the blast was intensified by the incompressibility of water, which transmitted the shock wave with destructive force. A single bomb exploding beneath the waterline could break a ship's keel, rupture its fuel tanks, flood its engines, and cause complete structural collapse. By the time the bomb exploded, the B-25 was already past the target, climbing sharply to escape both the shockwave and secondary explosions. The entire attack, from the opening burst of gunfire to the release of the bomb, lasted barely 10 seconds. Skip bombing itself wasn't a brand new concept. The British had already experimented with it, and several American pilots had tried similar methods on their own. However, combining skip bombing with overwhelming forward firepower was entirely Gunn's contribution. His redesigned nose turned the bomber into its own escort fighter, suppressing ship defenses before releasing its bombs. That combination would prove devastating. While Gunn focused on modifying aircraft, Allied intelligence kept close watch on Japanese naval activity. Ultra Intercepts, the Allied code-breaking operation that had deciphered Japanese naval codes, provided remarkably detailed insight into enemy movements. Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, known as FRU-MEL, was intercepting and reading Japanese communications almost as they were sent. In late February 1943, FRU-MEL intercepted messages revealing that a large Japanese convoy was gathering at Rabaul, on the island of New Britain. Its destination was Lae, on the northern coast of New Guinea, carrying troops and supplies to reinforce Japanese forces resisting Allied advances in Papua. The intelligence was precise. 8 transport ships were to carry roughly 6,900 soldiers of the 51st Division, escorted by 8 destroyers. The convoy would depart Rabaul at midnight on February 28, 1943, and was expected to reach Lae about 3 days later. This was Japan's maximum effort to reinforce New Guinea. If the convoy succeeded, Japanese strength in the region would increase dramatically, possibly halting the Allied push. But if it failed, Japan would lose thousands of seasoned troops and likely abandon any future major resupply attempt by sea. General Kenny saw in this intelligence the perfect opportunity to test both his modified aircraft and new low-level tactics against a target of immense strategic importance. He ordered every available aircraft in the theater to join a coordinated strike. The assault force would include B-17 flying fortresses attacking from medium altitude, Royal Australian Air Force Bow fighters strafing at low level, P-38 Lightning fighters providing air cover, and modified B-25 strafers executing skip bombing runs. It would become the largest combined air operation in the Southwest Pacific up to that point. Kenny personally briefed the squadron commanders on February 28th. His instructions were clear and uncompromising. Locate the convoy, attack relentlessly, give no quarter, and destroy every vessel. This was not to be a simple raid. It was to be annihilation. At midnight on February 28, 1943, the Japanese convoy left Simpson Harbor at Rabaul under the command of Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura aboard the destroyer Shirayuki. The convoy consisted of 8 transports: Kyokusei Maru, Kenbu Maru, Teiyo Maru, Nojima, Ayo Maru, Taimei Maru, Shinai Maru, and Oigawa Maru. 8 destroyers formed the escort: Shirayuki, Asashio, Arashio, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Uranami, Shikinami, and Asagumo. Roughly 100 Japanese Zero fighters were assigned to provide air cover throughout the voyage. It was the strongest Japanese force ever assembled for a resupply run. Kimura anticipated some losses. Every convoy to New Guinea had taken hits, but Japanese command believed enough ships would reach their destination to deliver the troops. They were mistaken. That afternoon, a B-24 Liberator on patrol sighted the convoy. The crew transmitted its position, course, and composition. Kenny's staff immediately dispatched reconnaissance aircraft to maintain contact. Initially, weather conditions favored the Japanese. 2 tropical storms swept through the region, shrouding the convoy in cloud cover and drastically reducing visibility. Allied aircraft managed to shadow the formation but were unable to strike effectively through the storms. The convoy moved steadily, averaging about 7 knots, roughly 8 miles per hour. The transport's heavy loads dictated the slow speed. The destroyers could easily make over 20 knots but were forced to reduce pace to stay with the slower cargo ships. By the evening of March 1st, the Japanese had advanced roughly 90 miles. They were about halfway to Leh. The worsening weather pleased Kimura, as fewer Allied aircraft could operate under those conditions. However, the storms also whipped up heavy seas that battered the transports. Below decks, cramped and airless, the soldiers suffered badly from seasickness. On the morning of March 2, 1943, the weather finally began to clear. Allied reconnaissance planes re-established visual contact with the enemy convoy. Around 10 in the morning, 29 B-17 Flying Fortresses launched an attack from roughly 5,000 feet. The high-altitude bombing, as expected, achieved little effect. The B-17 crews reported several hits, but Japanese records later confirmed only minimal damage. Perhaps one transport was slightly affected. Still, the attack achieved one important result. It forced the convoy to alter its course multiple times, slowing its advance toward Leh. Throughout March 2nd, additional B-17 raids followed. The Flying Fortresses dropped dozens of bombs from varying altitudes. Japanese ships weaved wildly to avoid hits, while Zero fighters intercepted the bombers. Several B-17s sustained damage, though 3 Japanese fighters were destroyed. Despite the chaos, no ships went down. The high-altitude attacks were merely harassing the convoy rather than halting it. As darkness fell on March 2nd, General Kenny knew that the decisive blow would have to come the following morning. The modified B-25s were prepared and armed. Major Ed Larner had briefed his pilots again and again. They had rehearsed their attack runs over a wrecked ship on February 28th, coordinating formations of B-17s, B-25s, P-38s, and bow fighters. Every airman understood the mission. The skip bombing sequence had been practiced meticulously. The harmonization of the strafer guns was complete. All bombs and ammunition were loaded, and the final preparations were done. The point of no return was near. At dawn on March 3, 1943, weather conditions were ideal for an air offensive. The skies were clear, visibility was excellent, and the seas calm. Rear Admiral Kimura must have felt a creeping sense of foreboding. His convoy was about 30 miles from Leh, close enough for some land-based anti-aircraft guns to assist, yet still exposed to air assault. The Allied strike force gathered at Cape Ward Hunt on Papua's northern coast. Nearly 90 Allied aircraft converged on the convoy, including B-17 Flying Fortresses, modified B-25 Strafers, Royal Australian Air Force Bow fighters, and P-38 Lightning fighters for escort. Multiple attack waves would strike from different directions throughout the day. The attack began around 10 in the morning. The B-17s struck first from medium altitude, drawing attention and forcing the Japanese ships to maneuver. Then, the low-level attackers descended. The bow fighters swept in first, strafing with 4 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns, suppressing anti-aircraft fire. The destroyers retaliated with everything they had, but the attackers were too fast to track. Moments later, the modified B-25 Strafers roared in, and the slaughter commenced. The B-25s participated in several attack waves throughout the morning. One pilot singled out the transport Kyokusei Maru and dropped to 50 feet above the water. At 1,000 yards, he opened fire. 8 50 caliber machine guns, firing a combined 6,800 rounds per minute, delivering nearly 180 pounds of lead per second, tore into the ship's hull. The glowing tracers revealed the deadly stream of bullets as they swept from bow to stern, shredding everything in their path. Japanese sailors were cut down instantly. Anti-aircraft positions were obliterated. The bridge disintegrated under the withering fire. Metal fragments and debris filled the air. Then the pilot released his bombs. 2 500-pound general-purpose explosives fitted with delayed fuses. They struck the water about 200 yards from the target, skipped once, and slammed into the hull just below the waterline amidships. The pilot pulled up sharply and banked away. Behind him, the bombs detonated. Twin underwater explosions ripped open Kyokusei Maru's lower hull. The ship shuddered violently as seawater flooded the engine room and lower holds. Listing heavily to port, the vessel began sinking almost immediately, disappearing beneath the surface within 15 minutes. Other modified B-25s followed in successive runs. Each pilot chose a target and executed the same devastating attack pattern. Guns blazing, bombs skipping, ships erupting in flames. The transport Kenbu Maru sustained multiple direct hits, attacked by at least 3 B-25s. Combined gunfire wiped out most of the crew topside. 4 bombs detonated below the waterline, breaking the ship in half. It sank in less than 10 minutes. The Teo Maru was strafed so savagely that fires broke out across its upper decks. 2 bombs ruptured its hull, and the ship went down with nearly 1,000 troops trapped inside. The transport Nojima tried desperately to evade, but was far too slow. A B-25 strafed it from stern to bow, then dropped 2 bombs into its engine room. The vessel lost power, took on water, and eventually sank later that day. Meanwhile, bow fighters and remaining B-25s turned their fire on the destroyers. The Shirayuki, Admiral Kimura's flagship, was raked by heavy gunfire that killed almost everyone on the bridge, including Kimura himself, who was wounded. A bomb struck near the stern, igniting a magazine fire. The resulting explosions tore off the stern section, and the destroyer quickly went under. The Tokitsukaze took direct bomb hits that set its fuel tanks ablaze, turning it into a blazing inferno that sank within an hour. The Arashio collided with the damaged transport Nojima while maneuvering and sustained catastrophic damage. The ship was abandoned and eventually sank beneath the waves. Throughout the assault, Japanese Zero fighters fought desperately to defend the convoy. However, P-38 Lightnings intercepted them at higher altitude while the B-25s struck from the opposite side of the formation. Some B-25s were lost to enemy fire, but the overall coordination between Allied aircraft remained flawless. Operating at masthead height, so low that Japanese fighters couldn't safely engage without risking their own ships, the B-25 crews executed their runs with deadly precision. The entire engagement lasted roughly 40 minutes. When the Allied planes finally withdrew to rearm and refuel, the scene left behind was nothing short of apocalyptic. 4 transports were either sinking or already gone beneath the surface. 3 destroyers had been obliterated. The remaining vessels were scattered, several damaged, all surrounded by wreckage and fire. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers and sailors now struggled in the sea. Bodies floated among twisted debris while thick oil slicks burned on the waves. Later that afternoon, Allied aircraft returned to strike again. The modified B-25s located the crippled remnants of the convoy still attempting to limp toward Leh. Their attacks were precise and relentless. Each vessel was singled out for destruction. The strafer B-25s came in low over the water, guns roaring and bombs skipping across the waves. More transports were sent to the bottom. The destroyer Asashio, already heavily damaged, took more direct hits and went down. By nightfall on March 3rd, every one of the 8 transports and half of the 8 destroyers had been sunk. Roughly 3,000 Japanese sailors and soldiers were dead or drowning. Another 2,700 survivors were rescued by the remaining destroyers and by submarines sent out from Rabaul. Only about 1,200 troops eventually reached Leh, many of them without weapons or equipment. Out of 6,900 men who had departed Rabaul, more than 5,700 became casualties. The convoy had been completely destroyed. Allied losses were astonishingly light. 1 B-17 Flying Fortress had been shot down. 3 P-38 fighters were lost in aerial combat, and 13 airmen were killed. Compared with Japan's catastrophic losses, it was a minor cost. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, as it would later be known, marked a decisive turning point in the Pacific campaign. It proved beyond doubt that land-based bombers could annihilate a heavily escorted convoy at sea. It also demonstrated the devastating power of skip bombing when paired with overwhelming forward gunfire. Every modification that Gunn had made to the B-25 was now fully vindicated. Most importantly, the battle convinced Japanese commanders that large-scale sea resupply operations in the Southwest Pacific were no longer possible. Never again would Japan attempt a major troop convoy to New Guinea. From that point onward, Japanese forces there slowly starved and weakened as their supply lines dried up. General MacArthur issued an official communique claiming that 22 ships had been destroyed, including 3 cruisers and 7 destroyers, and over 12,000 troops killed. The actual numbers were lower, yet still devastating. Such exaggerations were typical wartime propaganda. What truly mattered was the strategic outcome. General Kenny had proven that his theories worked. Skip bombing was not only practical but highly effective. Modified bombers could devastate naval formations, and low-level attacks could succeed even in the face of heavy defenses. Paul Gunn, following the reports from Australia, must have felt a grim sense of satisfaction. His creations had decimated a Japanese convoy and killed thousands of enemy soldiers. Yet his family remained imprisoned in Santo Tomas, and the war was far from finished. The success of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea immediately accelerated the modification program. Kenny ordered that all available B-25s in the theater be converted to the strafer configuration. Gunn worked harder than ever, training new crews, refining techniques, and expanding production. By mid-1943, nearly all B-25s in the Southwest Pacific had been modified. North American Aviation, the original manufacturer, soon took notice. Company representatives visited Gunn's workshops, examined his changes, and requested full technical details. They planned to incorporate his designs into factory-built aircraft. Gunn was promoted to major and sent to the United States to collaborate with North American Aviation at its Inglewood and Kansas City plants. During several months in 1943 and early 1944, Gunn worked closely with company engineers to develop factory-produced strafer variants of the B-25. The result was the B-25G, fitted with a 75mm cannon in the nose, along with 4 50 caliber machine guns. A total of 405 B-25Gs were built. The 75mm gun fired a 14.7-pound shell capable of piercing ship armor or demolishing fortified positions. However, the weapon was cumbersome to load, required a crewman in the nose, and had a slow rate of fire. Gunn personally tested the B-25G in combat, leading a raid with the 3rd Attack Group against a Japanese destroyer. He struck the ship's fire control system with a cannon, crippling its ability to aim its weapons, after which bombs finished the job. Though Gunn publicly claimed the cannon had sunk the destroyer, he privately admitted that the bombs had delivered the fatal blow. The B-25H followed as the next production model. 1,000 B-25Hs were built, carrying the same 75mm cannon, but with 14 50 caliber guns mounted in various positions. The H model moved the dorsal turret forward and removed the co-pilot's seat to save weight, with the navigator responsible for loading the cannon. This massive increase in armament came with drawbacks. The B-25H was nose-heavy and difficult to handle. Wright Field, the Army Air Force's testing center, sent Gunn a message warning that the design was unsafe and should be grounded until the center of gravity issue was fixed. Legend says Gunn replied, "Put center of gravity in storage for the duration. We have a war to fight." Whether or not the story is true, it perfectly captured Gunn's attitude toward risk and innovation. Technical precision mattered less than raw combat effectiveness. The pilots quickly adapted, learning how to handle the aircraft's balance issues in the air. The final production model, the B-25J, returned to using a conventional bombardier's nose on some versions, while others kept the strafer-style solid nose. A total of 4,318 B-25Js were produced, making it the most widely built version of the series. Certain B-25Js carried 8 forward-firing guns in the nose, 4 in side blisters, 2 in the dorsal turret, and 4 more mounted in waist positions. Altogether, some configurations carried up to 18 50 caliber machine guns, making it the most heavily armed bomber of the entire Second World War. In many situations, that immense firepower was excessive, but its psychological effect was undeniable. Japanese troops came to dread the sound of its engines. The distinct roar meant death was approaching fast. Throughout 1943 and 1944, the modified B-25s wreaked havoc on Japanese targets across the Pacific. In August 1943, B-25 strafers launched a massive assault on Japanese airfields at Wewak in New Guinea. The raids destroyed 174 aircraft on the ground, effectively crippling Japanese air power in the region. Those Wewak operations were made possible because Gunn had solved yet another challenge: range. The B-25s had sufficient endurance for most missions, but Wewak was at the extreme edge. Gunn designed a system using auxiliary fuel tanks fitted into the bomb bay. After the extra fuel was used, the tanks were dropped through an opening in the floor. The setup was crude. Fumes filled the fuselage and wind blew through the cabin, but it extended the aircraft's reach by several hundred miles. The Wewak raids shattered Japan's aerial dominance over New Guinea and allowed Allied ground troops to advance with minimal air resistance. In November 1943, B-25 strafers struck Rabaul Harbor in one of the most dramatic air raids of the war. Major Raymond "Jock" Hennebrey led 38 B-25s against shipping clustered in the heavily fortified harbor. The attack was carried out at masthead level, with P-38s providing top cover and phosphorus bombs generating thick smoke screens. Of 38 enemy ships in the harbor, 30 were hit directly. 1 heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, and numerous transports and auxiliary vessels were sunk or badly damaged. The raid crippled Rabaul's ability to function as a forward base and proved that even Japan's strongest fortresses were not safe from the modified B-25s. During the Philippines campaign in 1944, the B-25 strafers provided relentless close air support, cut off Japanese supply lines, and attacked shipping across the islands. The aircraft earned the nickname "Bat Out of Hell" because its attacks came so fast and low that defenders had no chance to react. Gunn's modified B-25s weren't the only tools bringing victory in the Pacific, but they were among the most deadly. They destroyed hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft on the ground, and tens of thousands of enemy troops. They isolated Japanese garrisons, ensuring MacArthur's island-hopping strategy could move forward unimpeded. They granted Allied forces air superiority, making future amphibious operations possible. Meanwhile, Gunn's personal war continued. His wife and children were still imprisoned at Santo Tomas. Occasionally, censored letters reached him through the Red Cross, but communication was rare and uncertain. He knew that conditions inside the camp were worsening. Japanese guards grew more brutal as the war turned against them. Food supplies dwindled. Disease spread rapidly. Gunn could do nothing but keep fighting, hoping every mission brought the war's end closer. In late 1944, American troops landed on Leyte in the Philippines. Gunn was there, still flying combat missions at 45 years old, still seeking new ways to make his aircraft deadlier. One night that same year, Japanese bombers struck Tacloban airfield on Leyte. Gunn was on the ground when white phosphorus bombs detonated nearby. Shrapnel tore into his shoulder, inflicting severe wounds. The injury left his right arm useless and caused excruciating pain. He was evacuated to Australia for surgery and spent several months recovering. The wound ended Gunn's combat flying days, though by then the war was nearly finished. On February 3, 1945, units of the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division, moving rapidly toward Manila, liberated Santo Tomas internment camp. The troops arrived just as Japanese guards were preparing to execute the camp leaders. In the chaos of the street fighting, American soldiers freed more than 4,000 prisoners. Among them were Polly Gunn and her 4 children. They had endured 3 years and 14 days of captivity. The family was thin, traumatized, but alive. General MacArthur personally visited the camp soon after liberation and met the Gunn family. He arranged for them to be flown to Australia to reunite with Pappy Gunn. The reunion happened only weeks later. The man who had left Manila on Christmas Eve, 1941, finally embraced his family again. Polly had somehow kept their children alive through unimaginable hardship. The boys, now young men, had survived separation from the women's quarters. The girls had endured years of deprivation and fear. They were together again, though none of them were the same as before. The war had left its mark on all of them. After recovering from his wounds, Gunn remained in the Army Air Forces. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel and continued working on aircraft modification projects and tactical development, though he no longer flew in combat. He officially retired from active military duty on June 30, 1948. With the rank of full colonel, medically discharged due to the lasting effects of his combat wounds. His honors included the Distinguished Flying Cross with 1 oak leaf cluster denoting a second award, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Air Medal, 9 Purple Hearts, and numerous unit citations and campaign ribbons. Those 9 Purple Hearts represented 9 separate occasions when he was injured or wounded in combat. After leaving service, Gunn returned to the Philippines and helped rebuild Philippine Airlines. The nation was emerging from years of brutal occupation and the devastation of its liberation. Gunn played a crucial role in restoring air transportation, reconnecting the many islands that had been isolated for so long. He continued to fly, to take risks, and to push limits as he always had. On October 11, 1957, just a week before his 58th birthday, Gunn was piloting a charter flight when his aircraft encountered a violent storm. The plane went down. Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn died doing what he had done his entire adult life, flying. He was laid to rest at Barrancas National Cemetery at Naval Air Station, Pensacola, Florida, where he had once served as a young flight instructor. His legacy endured in countless ways. The B-25 strafer conversions he developed became standard practice for the remainder of the war. Of the approximately 9,890 B-25 Mitchells built, thousands were modified into strafers based on Gunn's original designs. The skip bombing technique he perfected destroyed hundreds of Japanese vessels and played a vital role in securing Allied victory across the Pacific. Gunn proved that ingenuity could come from anywhere, even from one grieving father working in a field hangar under wartime pressure. The official military establishment preferred to fight the war with existing equipment and traditional tactics. Gunn demonstrated that desperate situations demanded new, sometimes unorthodox, solutions. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea soon became a classic case study in military academies around the world. It showed how intelligence, coordination, innovation, and daring tactics could achieve total victory at minimal cost. It also illustrated the true potential of air power against naval targets when used with precision and imagination. 8 transports destroyed, 4 destroyers sunk, over 5,000 casualties, all for the loss of only 4 Allied aircraft. The numbers spoke for themselves, brutal and final. No force could survive when the enemy ruled the skies. Every ship lost in the Bismarck Sea meant dozens of missions never flown. Hundreds of soldiers who would never reach the battlefield, and thousands of shells that would never be fired. Cutting off supplies before they ever reached combat was the most efficient form of warfare imaginable. The modified B-25 became the key weapon that made this possible. It could fly hundreds of miles to locate convoys, suppress their defenses with overwhelming firepower, destroy them through skip bombing attacks, and then return safely to base for another mission. A single B-25 strafer could accomplish what once required the coordination of several different aircraft types. Japan learned that lesson far too late. After the Bismarck Sea catastrophe, Japanese commanders realized they could no longer move large convoys during daylight within range of Allied air bases. They shifted to nighttime operations, used submarines for vital cargo, and relied increasingly on small barges that could hide along the coast during daylight hours. These tactics reduced losses somewhat, but never eliminated them. B-25 strafers hunted these barges with the same deadly precision they had shown against larger ships. Night-flying versions equipped with radar located enemy convoys even in total darkness. There was no safe route, no safe time, and no secure method left for Japanese logistics in the Southwest Pacific. Month by month, the noose tightened until entire Japanese garrisons were effectively isolated. In New Guinea, the Philippines, and across the island chains, Japanese soldiers fought on with dwindling rations, little ammunition, and no hope of reinforcement. They were courageous, determined, and utterly doomed. Air superiority, achieved largely through weapons like the modified B-25, rendered that courage meaningless. By 1945, the B-25 in its strafer form had become the standard anti-shipping aircraft of the Pacific theater. It evolved through the G, H, and J variants, each featuring heavier armament and improved firepower. Yet, at its core, the concept remained pure gun. The idea of turning a medium bomber into a flying gunship capable of suppressing defenses and delivering lethal attacks at extremely low altitude. When the war finally ended in August 1945, modified B-25s were still flying combat sorties. They were among the aircraft that escorted the Japanese surrender delegation from Tokyo to Manila in mid-August. It was fitting that the very aircraft which had helped bring Japan to its knees were present to witness its surrender. Post-war studies by both American and Japanese historians confirmed the significance of Gunn's contributions. Japanese naval officers later admitted that after the Bismarck Sea defeat, they knew it was no longer possible to operate safely within range of Allied air power. The psychological effect proved just as significant as the physical destruction itself. Convoy commanders understood that low-flying bombers could appear without warning, annihilating entire formations before defenses had any chance to react. The modified B-25s had introduced a completely new form of warfare, medium bombers that hunted ships with the precision of submarines and the firepower of naval cruisers. The lessons extended well beyond the Pacific Campaign. After the war, air forces across the world examined the tactics of skip bombing and the use of heavy forward-firing armament. The concept of the gunship, an aircraft built primarily for direct gun attack rather than traditional bombing, became a permanent part of modern air doctrine. The AC-47, AC-119, and AC-130 gunships used in Vietnam and later conflicts were direct conceptual descendants of Gunn's modified B-25s. Of the 9,890 B-25 Mitchells produced during World War II, more than 100 still exist today, most of them in the United States. Many are kept airworthy and appear at air shows where crowds are captivated by their sound, power, and history. The deep growl of the twin Wright R2600 engines is unmistakable. Watching a B-25 banking low over an airfield, just as they once did over Japanese convoys, instantly recalls the terror and brilliance of their missions. Several surviving B-25s are maintained in full strafer configuration, complete with forward-firing guns mounted in the nose. During demonstrations, when these guns fire blanks, the experience is deafening. The muzzle flash is clearly visible, and the entire aircraft shakes under the recoil. Seeing a B-25 strafer in action, even in simulation, gives spectators a sense of what Japanese sailors must have felt during those final, frantic seconds before their ships were torn apart. Museums around the world preserve B-25s in various configurations. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, displays several examples. At the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, where Gunn once served as an instructor, a B-25 honors his legacy. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum also preserves the story. Each aircraft stands as a symbol of innovation, courage, and victory born from desperation. In 1959, General George C. Kenney published The Saga of Pappy Gunn, a biography dedicated to the man whose ingenuity had helped change the course of the war. By then retired, Kenney wanted to ensure that Gunn's achievements would not fade into obscurity. The book detailed Gunn's aircraft modifications, his daring combat missions, and his deeply personal battle to rescue his family. Kenney wrote that Pappy Gunn was one of the most vital figures in the Pacific Campaign, a man whose unauthorized innovations saved countless Allied lives and shortened the conflict. Nathaniel Gunn, Pappy's youngest son, later contributed his own accounts, offering the family's perspective on life in Santo Tomas and the agonizing wait for liberation. The story of the Gunn family became an enduring testament to the human cost of war and the extraordinary strength required to survive it. In 1975, the United States Air Force posthumously honored Pappy Gunn by naming a training facility after him, recognition that was long overdue but deeply deserved. Gunn never sought fame. His only pursuit was effectiveness. His story, how one engineer's unapproved modifications evolved into a devastatingly successful weapons system, remains profoundly relevant. He refused to accept his family's captivity as unchangeable. He refused to believe that existing tools were sufficient. He refused to let regulations stand in the way of progress. That defiance, combined with his technical genius and General Kenney's trust, produced aircraft that revolutionized aerial warfare. The B-25 Strafer destroyed hundreds of Japanese vessels, killed thousands of enemy soldiers, and made a decisive contribution to Allied victory in the Pacific. It proved that true innovation often comes from unexpected places and succeeds through unconventional means. The modified B-25 alone did not win the Second World War. That triumph required millions of people, thousands of weapons, and years of relentless struggle. Yet the impact of the modified B-25 was far greater than its numbers suggested. It embodied what happens when necessity meets opportunity, when personal determination aligns with military need, when one man decides that surrender is not an option. This weapon was born in a maintenance hangar, forged out of grief and desperation. It thundered into battle at masthead height, guns blazing, bombs skipping across the waves to smash through steel hulls and detonate below the surface. It shattered Japan's hope of resupplying its forces. It shortened the war. It saved Allied lives. And in the end, it freed one man's family after 3 long years of imprisonment, which had been his mission from the very beginning.